It was a long drive from Austin to El Paso, a road trip that stretched across the Texas landscape. I had decided to keep going as far as I could before stopping for the night at some cheap motel. I wasn't a fan of driving at night, but the unbearable heat during the day had worn me down. My car's AC wasn't great either, and the evening's cooler air seemed like the perfect relief. Texas can get pretty hot, and I didn't want to deal with the discomfort of driving in the heat anymore. As I cruised along, the road was surprisingly empty for this stretch of highway, rare in Texas. Usually this highway is full of trucks and cars, but not tonight. It felt like I had the whole road to myself, the vast open space stretching out in front of me. This part of Texas is known for its desolate roads. The highway seemed to go on forever, with no lights in sight except for the occasional distant glow from a ranch or a gas station far off the road. The night was eerily quiet and pitch black, as if the stars themselves had been swallowed by the emptiness of the sky. The only thing keeping the world visible were my headlights, which cut through the darkness, illuminating a small patch of the road ahead. The quiet was almost unsettling. I was used to the usual sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the wind rustling through the trees, but tonight there was nothing. The silence was oppressive. I was lost in my thoughts, letting the hum of the car and the random podcast I was listening to keep me company when something caught my eye. At first, it was just a flicker in the distance, nothing more than a strange glimmer in the blackness. But as I got closer, I saw that it was a car stopped on the shoulder of the road. Its hazard lights were flashing, casting a dim orange glow against the night. My attention shifted, and as I drew nearer, I noticed something even more unsettling. A man was lying on the ground next to the car. He was motionless, his body sprawled out in an unnatural way, and it instantly made me wonder what had happened. My first instinct was that it might have been some sort of medical emergency. Maybe the man had collapsed from exhaustion, or even worse, had a heart attack while driving. His car was still there, though the driver's side door was slightly ajar, suggesting he had gotten out before collapsing. The absence of visible damage to the car, no signs of a crash, no skid marks on the road, made me rule out the possibility of an accident. I slowed my car, pulling over behind the vehicle, my headlights shining on the scene. There was no movement from the man, which made my stomach tighten. Even though my mind was screaming that something didn't feel right, I knew I couldn't just drive away. I had been taught my whole life to help someone in need, especially if it seemed like an emergency. But a part of me, some primal instinct, told me to stay cautious. My heart was pounding in my chest. This wasn't a situation I was prepared for. I wasn't a trained medical professional, and the man lying there seemed to be in a serious condition. His clothes were soiled, and his limbs were splayed out in a way that looked strange, almost unnatural. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just drive away and call 911 instead. But I couldn't leave him there if he was really in danger. I rolled down my window halfway, trying to stay calm and assess the situation. I leaned out of my window and called out, "Hey buddy, you okay?" Well, I expected some kind of response, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, not even a groan. "Sir, do you need help?" I called out louder this time, but again, no response. The eerie silence around us only added to the tension. I turned off the podcast I had been listening to, trying to focus all my attention on the man, on the situation. I didn't know if I should get closer or wait for some sign of life. Another part of me wanted to just drive away. It didn't feel right, none of it did. But I kept thinking, what if he was dying? What if this was a life or death situation? I couldn't just leave him. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but of course the signal was weak, typical for this middle of nowhere stretch of road. I tapped the screen again, hoping the call would go through, but it didn't. Frustrated by the lack of signal, I grabbed a small flashlight I kept in the glove compartment, deciding to get out and see if I could help in some other way. The warm, heavy air hit me as I stepped out of the car, and the silence seemed even more suffocating now that I was away from the safety of my vehicle. It felt like everything around me was holding its breath, and the usual sounds of the night, the chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves, were strangely absent. I walked cautiously toward the man, shining my flashlight on him. He was still lying there, completely motionless. The closer I got, the more I began to feel like something was wrong, but I couldn't quite place it. There was no blood, no signs of trauma. It just didn't make sense. That's when I noticed movement, not from the man on the ground, but from the shadows beyond the car. A figure emerged from the dark, stepping into the dim glow of my flashlight. My stomach dropped. Another man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face, casting his features in shadow. I hadn't seen him standing there at all. He had come out of nowhere. My pulse quickened. "Need some help, friend?" he asked, his voice low and gruff, as though he was expecting me to respond. My mind raced. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right here. No, I'm good," I replied quickly, trying to back away, but my body felt frozen. I was starting to panic now. This was not just a random roadside emergency, it was something much darker. The man smirked, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Doesn't look like it. You're real kind to stop like this." I didn't like the way he was looking at me, the way his words felt more like a threat than a statement. I started backing away toward my car, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I couldn't keep my eyes on both men at once, on the one lying on the ground and the one standing in front of me. But I tried. I knew something was very wrong. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "I thought someone needed help, that's all." But the man's response sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, we do," he said with a strange emphasis. Then his hand reached behind his back, and I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. Instinct took over. I didn't think, I just ran. I turned and bolted for my car, fumbling for my keys with trembling hands. I could hear the man shout behind me, his voice full of menace, but I didn't stop. My flashlight slipped from my hand and hit the ground, but I didn't even pause to look back. I reached my car, practically throwing myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My fingers scrambled to lock the doors just as the man reached my car. He yanked on the handle, pulling at the door, and his face was inches from mine through the window. "Get out!" he screamed, slamming his fist against the glass. My heart raced as I threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching in protest. I backed up onto the highway, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The other man, the one who had been lying on the ground, was on his feet now, sprinting toward me. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I floored the gas pedal, my heart pounding in my chest. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the middle of the highway, watching me drive away, but I didn't stop until I reached the next town. Story 2. A couple of years ago, I embarked on a road trip across Texas. I was driving from Houston to El Paso, a journey that takes you through some of the most desolate stretches of road imaginable. The highway was long, straight, and dotted with few towns. I was deep in the heart of nowhere where you can drive for hours without seeing another car or building. The land around me was vast and open, stretching out in every direction with nothing to break the monotony. It's the kind of place where help would be a long time coming if you found yourself in trouble, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was completely alone in this barren landscape. The silence of the open road was only broken by the hum of my engine and the occasional gust of wind that swept across the land. It was a late afternoon, maybe around 4:30 or 5 p.m. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway. I'd been driving for hours straight, not stopping for anything but the occasional stretch of the legs, and hadn't passed another car in at least 30 minutes. The isolation was starting to weigh on me. The further I went, the more I felt like I was traveling into the heart of nowhere. With the sun dipping lower, it felt like the day was winding down, and the desert landscape around me seemed to take on a more ominous tone. There was no one else around, no signs of life in sight, and the road ahead seemed endless. The empty stretches of land felt like they were swallowing me whole, and I couldn't help but wonder how vulnerable I was out here. Just when I was starting to feel like I'd been driving forever without any sign of civilization, I saw him. A man, standing on the shoulder of the road, waving his arms at me. My first instinct was to keep driving. But as I got closer, I noticed he was standing next to an old sedan with the hood popped open. The car was tilted slightly as if it had a flat tire or maybe even a mechanical issue. The man appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans. There was nothing outwardly strange about him, and he didn't look like the kind of person who would seem out of place on the side of the road. He seemed frustrated but not aggressive. My mind raced with the familiar warnings that come with being in a remote place like this. Don't stop for strangers. I knew it was a risk, but I also couldn't ignore the part of me that understood the sheer desperation in his gestures. In that moment, I weighed the situation. If I were in his shoes, I would want someone to stop and help me. I slowed down, pulling over to the side of the road a little ahead of him, leaving my engine running. Something about the whole situation felt off, but my instinct told me to help him. It was daylight, and there wasn't much risk of being caught off guard by the dark. As I stopped, he jogged up to the passenger side of the car, where I cracked the window just enough for him to speak to me, but not enough for him to reach inside. I kept my hands on the wheel, my mind alert. "Hey man, thanks for stopping," he said, panting lightly. His voice was tired, and he looked like he'd been standing there for a while. "My car broke down and my phone's dead. I've been trying to flag someone down for over an hour. Do you think you could give me a ride to the next gas station or let me use your phone to call for help?" He looked frustrated, but it wasn't in a violent way. More like a regular guy who just wanted to solve a problem. Still, I felt something in the back of my mind telling me to be careful. As he spoke, he seemed genuine. I could hear the frustration in his voice, the exhaustion of being stranded in the middle of nowhere. There was something about his expression that made me feel bad for him, and I started to consider stopping to help. But as he mentioned the gas station, I couldn't ignore a small nagging feeling. Why hadn't he called anyone yet? Why was he asking for a ride to a place that might not even be on the main highway? "Where's the nearest gas station?" I asked. "There's one about 15 miles up the road," he answered, his voice sounding relieved. "But it's not directly on the highway. You gotta take a turn off about 5 miles ahead. I can show you where it is." That sounded strange to me. Why couldn't he just give me the name of the gas station or tell me how to get there? It wasn't adding up. A subtle alarm went off in my head. Still, I didn't want to make a snap judgment. I hesitated for a moment, then decided I would help him another way. "I can call them for you," I said, pulling out my phone. At this point, I felt like I was trying to cover all bases, helping him, but keeping some distance. "That's the thing," he replied, scratching his neck nervously. "I don't know the number. I was just going to ride with you, and we could get there together." His response didn't sit right with me. If he had been stranded out there for a while, how did he not know the number of a nearby gas station? And if he was really that desperate for help, why didn't he have a backup plan? This made me uneasy. My gut was screaming at me that something wasn't right. "I'm not comfortable giving rides to strangers, especially out here," I said firmly. His face changed slightly. A look of subtle disappointment or maybe even annoyance flashed across it, but instead of getting angry, he simply nodded. "All right, man," he said after a brief pause. "I get it. Do you think you could at least give me some water? I've been out here for a while and it's pretty hot." That didn't seem unreasonable. I had a couple of water bottles in the back seat and he did look like he'd been out there for a long time, so I nodded. "Yeah, hang on," I said, reaching back to grab one. But as I did, I noticed something unsettling. He had stepped closer to the car, too close. In fact, it felt like he was trying to peer inside, getting a little too curious about what was in my car. My heart rate quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I handed him a bottle through the cracked window. "Thanks," he said, unscrewing the cap and taking a long drink. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then leaned a little closer to the window. "You sure you can't give me a ride? It'd really help me out." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. I could sense that the frustration I had seen earlier was turning into something else, something more insistent. "Sorry, man, I can't," I said, my voice a little firmer than before. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at me. The shift in his demeanor was almost imperceptible at first, but then I saw it. His eyes grew colder, like he was trying to mask something darker beneath the surface. I could feel my stomach drop, and the air around me seemed to thicken with tension. It was like he was weighing his next move. That's when the shift happened, and it was sudden. His expression went from calm to something more unsettling. I couldn't exactly put my finger on it, but his eyes seemed to harden. And the way he stood there, staring at me, felt different now. He took a small step back, but the tension remained. His entire posture seemed to change, like a switch had flipped in his mind. "All right," he said finally, stepping back a bit. "Thanks for the water." But his tone had shifted. Now there was something colder in it. I quickly started to roll the window up, wanting to get out of this uncomfortable situation, but before I could finish, he lunged forward with lightning speed and grabbed the door handle. I yelled, "What the hell?" and tried to lock the doors, but it was too late. He yanked the door open with terrifying force, and within seconds, a small knife appeared in his hand. It wasn't a large blade, but it was enough to make me freeze in fear. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced as he spoke in a calm, measured tone. "Hand over your wallet and your car keys," he said, his voice low and steady, almost eerily calm. I couldn't think straight. The fear was paralyzing. I wanted to resist, to do something, anything, but I could only stare at the blade. With shaky hands, I pulled out my wallet and tossed it to him, then grabbed the keys from the ignition and handed them over too. "Get out of the car," he commanded, motioning with the knife. I was certain that he was going to take the car and leave me stranded in the middle of nowhere. But instead of getting in himself, he just stood there, holding the knife, watching me. It was like he was deciding what to do next. "I'm not going to hurt you," he finally said, though his grip on the knife never loosened. "Just walk down the road and don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I got out of the car, my heart hammering in my chest. Without a word, I started walking, trying not to look back. I heard the sound of him getting into the car, followed by the engine starting. But instead of speeding off, he just sat there, watching me through the rearview mirror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the car drive away. I didn't look back until I had walked at least a mile. When I finally dared to turn around, the road behind me was empty. Hours later, I flagged down another car and eventually made my way to a gas station. I called the police, but they never found him. The guy was gone, along with my car and everything inside it. To this day, I can't stop thinking about how close I came to something much worse happening. I gave up my keys, but what would have happened if I had fought back, if I hadn't handed them over? I'll never know for sure, and that thought haunts me. Story 3. I was driving through the Texas desert, making my way from El Paso to Austin, and it was well past midnight. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, and I could barely see anything beyond the limited reach of my headlights. The landscape was desolate, with no signs of civilization in sight. The only company I had was the occasional reflector on the side of the road, shining dimly. It was eerie, driving through such an isolated part of the world where the stillness felt suffocating. I had been on the road for hours, and my fuel gauge was getting dangerously close to empty. I had no idea when I'd come across another town or gas station, but I was running low and knew I needed to find fuel soon. Then in the distance I saw a flicker of light. As I got closer, I could make out the sign for a gas station up ahead. It looked like something from an old movie, small, run down, and nearly forgotten. There was a single buzzing fluorescent light hanging over the station, casting an eerie glow that didn't make the place feel any safer. The gas pumps were weathered, and the entire place looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen any real business in years. The parking lot was practically empty except for one other vehicle, an old beat-up truck with rusted edges parked off to the side. My heart lifted in relief, least there was some sign of life here. I pulled up to the pump, my tires crunching on the gravel, and got out to fill my tank. As I stood by the pump, filling my car, I noticed a figure leaning against the wall near the entrance of the station. He was a man wearing a faded, tattered flannel shirt and worn-out jeans. A baseball cap was pulled low over his face, hiding most of his features, but he looked rough, like someone who had been out in the elements for far too long. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the task at hand, but then I heard his voice. "Hey! Man, you headed east." It was deep, but there was something strange about the way he spoke. It was as if he was trying to sound casual, but something was off, like his words were forced. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to face him. "Yeah," I replied, my voice hesitant. He stepped forward slowly, eyes still mostly hidden by the brim of his cap. "Think you could give me a ride?" he asked. "My truck's busted, and I've been stuck here for hours, just need to get to the next town." I paused, weighing my options. Something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he looked, rough and dirty, as if he had been living out there for days, or maybe it was the isolation of the place. The gas station was empty, and there was no sign of an attendant. I felt a pang of sympathy for him. This was the middle of nowhere, and if he had been stranded here all night, that sucked. But at the same time, I knew I had to be careful. "Where's the next town?" I asked, trying to buy myself some time to think. "Just about 20 miles up the road," he answered casually. "Shouldn't take more than 30 minutes. I looked around again. Still no sign of any other cars or life. I was alone with this man in this desolate place. Against my better judgment, I agreed to help. "All right, sure," I said, the words feeling unnatural on my tongue. The man didn't seem to react the way I thought he would. His face didn't light up with relief or gratitude. Instead, he just nodded, and without another word, he grabbed a duffel bag from the ground next to him. The bag looked heavy, but he carried it with ease as he climbed into the passenger seat of my car. As soon as the door closed, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, and the smell of sweat and smoke seemed to seep into the vehicle. I turned the key in the ignition and drove off, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. I attempted to make small talk to break the silence, asking him what he was doing out here in the middle of nowhere. He gave short, one-word responses. "Just passing through," he said, not looking at me. I wanted to ask more questions. Where was he coming from? Where was he going? But something in the way he spoke made me hold back. He said his name was Joe, but I wasn't convinced. His entire demeanor seemed off. As we drove, I noticed he kept shifting in his seat, fidgeting with something in his lap. I couldn't see what it was, but it was making me increasingly nervous. We drove in silence for what felt like hours. The road was pitch black, and my headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world, driving through a never-ending desert. Then suddenly, Joe spoke again. "You can pull off up there. There's a shortcut. I know that'll get me where I need to go." My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen any turnoffs, no side roads up ahead, just more empty highway stretching on forever. I wasn't sure what kind of shortcut he was talking about. "I'd rather stay on the main road," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Though my hands were starting to sweat, Joe didn't respond right away. His silence felt heavy, like the air itself was thickening with tension. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. Then, Joe finally spoke again, his voice now more demanding. I said, "Pull off up there." His words were more forceful this time, his tone harder. I turned to glance at him and saw something in his eyes that made my skin crawl, dark and cold like he wasn't human anymore. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught the glint of metal. Joe had pulled a knife from his jacket, holding it low in his lap, just out of my direct line of sight. He wasn't pointing it at me, but the threat was clear. The air around me seemed to freeze. "Take the next turn," he said. His voice almost a growl. I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. My hands were slick with sweat and my heart raced in my chest. I could barely keep my grip on the steering wheel, but I had to act fast. The road was completely empty, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the low buzz of the fluorescent light in the car. I nodded, pretending to look for the turn he was talking about, but I was stalling. I knew if I turned off the main road, I'd be lost in the darkness. I wouldn't come back. I could feel panic rising in my chest, threatening to take over. I had to think of something, anything, to buy myself time. "I need to stop and take a leak," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice wavered, been holding it for a while. Joe stared at me for a long moment, his gaze piercing and intense. I could see him weighing the options, deciding whether or not to let me stop. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Make it quick," he said, his voice flat. I pulled the car over to the side of the road and put it in park. My mind was racing. I had no idea what to do next. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder and slipped it into my pocket. I pretended to walk toward the bushes, but as soon as I was out of his line of sight, I bolted. I ran as fast as I could into the darkness, not daring to look back. I could hear Joe shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. Eventually, I found a small ditch and crouched down, gasping for breath. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, giving them my location as best as I could. I stayed hidden until the police arrived. When they did, they found my car, but Joe was gone. The officers searched the area and found the car a few hours later, abandoned in a field a few miles away. They found the duffel bag Joe had been carrying. It was filled with zip ties, duct tape, and a roll of plastic sheeting. To this day, I don't know what Joe had planned for me, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have made it out alive if I hadn't made that run for it. Story 4I didn't usually take long road trips, but this one was unavoidable. My sister was getting married in Houston, and I couldn't afford a plane ticket. So I decided to drive from El Paso to Houston. The plan seemed simple enough, just a straight shot across Texas with a few podcasts and snacks to keep me company on the road. I had been feeling a bit stressed, but I figured the long drive would give me some quiet time to clear my head. I had mapped out the route carefully, making sure that most of the driving would happen during daylight hours. That way, I could avoid driving late into the night, but of course, life had other plans. A few delays at work pushed my departure back by several hours. By the time I was finally on the road, the sun was setting and I realized I would be driving far later than I had intended. It was a bit unsettling, but I reassured myself that it would be fine. After all, this was just a drive across Texas. What could possibly go wrong? As the hours stretched on, the landscape around me began to change. The glow of the setting sun faded into the distance and the highway became shrouded in darkness. By the time I was halfway through, it was close to midnight. The stretch of highway I was on felt completely empty. There were barely any cars around. My headlights cut through the vast black emptiness of the road ahead. Every so often, a sign for a gas station or diner would flicker in the distance, providing a brief moment of light, but otherwise it was just me and the road. At first, the silence and isolation didn't bother me. In fact, I found it somewhat peaceful, almost soothing. There was something about the quiet hum of the car, the darkness, and the occasional flicker of my headlights that made everything feel a little surreal, almost like I was in a world of my own, but that tranquility didn't last long. As I continued down the highway, I became aware of something unsettling. There was a car behind me. It wasn't unusual to see another car on the road at this hour, especially since the highway wasn't completely deserted, but this car, it felt different. It was a black sedan, and it was following me far too closely for comfort. Its headlights were fixed on me, and they seemed to shine brighter the longer I drove. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to see if there was any sign of the driver, but all I could make out was the dim glow of their headlights. It felt like the car was almost tailing me. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just another driver on a late-night journey, I thought. They were probably in a hurry or just didn't want to pass. I figured I'd give them the benefit of the doubt, so I decided to slow down a little and move to the side, allowing them to pass. To my surprise, the car didn't pass. It stayed right behind me, matching my speed exactly. That strange feeling in the pit of my stomach grew stronger. I tried to push it down, telling myself not to overthink things. It was probably nothing, just a coincidence, right? But the more time passed, the more I felt a sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The car still followed me, staying right behind me no matter how fast or slow I drove. I decided to take a random exit off the highway, hoping that the car would just continue on its own path, but to my growing horror, the sedan followed me. It exited the highway with me. That's when I knew this wasn't just a coincidence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart started to race. What was going on? Why were they following me? I didn't know, but now the feeling in my gut told me that I needed to be cautious. I turned onto a smaller road, hoping that maybe the sedan would take another route. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, but my mind was racing. Every turn I made, the sedan followed, staying close behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in that car was deliberately trailing me. Their headlights glared in my rearview mirror, and I could almost feel their presence like a shadow, always there, never letting up. I needed to get to a place where I could think. I pulled into a gas station, hoping that if I parked there for a minute, the car would just drive by and I'd realize I was overreacting. But no, the sedan followed me in. It parked a few spaces away from my car. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to steady my breath. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but the outline of someone sitting in the car was unmistakable. My hands shook as I pretended to check my phone, waiting to see if they would make any move. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The sedan just sat there, parked and unmoving. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe I was just overthinking things. But the longer I waited, the more I felt like something was wrong. After what felt like an age, the car finally pulled out of the gas station lot and drove off. Relief washed over me, but I wasn't ready to get back on the road just yet. I waited for another 10 minutes just to make sure they weren't going to come back. Every time I looked in my rearview mirror, I half expected to see those headlights following me again. It was a stupid feeling, I thought, but I couldn't shake it. When I finally gathered the courage to get back on the road, I felt a little calmer. Maybe it had just been my imagination, I thought, but that calm didn't last long. Just 5 minutes later, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there they were, the black sedan. This time there was no doubt. They were back, and they weren't just behind me anymore. They were getting closer. The headlights grew brighter, and I felt my stomach drop. The sense of unease that had started as a whisper now roared in my chest. This wasn't a coincidence, this was deliberate. My heart raced and panic began to creep in. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Hi, there's a car following me. The car hadn't done anything wrong, it was just following me. What would the police even do? I tried to focus on the road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. But the more I tried to stay calm, the more I could feel the pressure of the car behind me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead, and a decision was made. Maybe if I parked near some other cars or went inside to use the restroom, I could get some reassurance that everything was okay. I pulled in, scanning the area for any signs of life, hoping to see a few cars parked or a trucker inside, but the lot was empty. I hesitated, was stopping really the right thing to do? Should I keep going? But I had already stopped, and there was no turning back. The sedan had slowed as it approached the rest stop, but instead of pulling in, it drove past me and disappeared down the road. For a moment, I dared to believe that everything was fine. Maybe they were just going the same way. But as soon as I merged back onto the highway, my heart sank. There they were again, right on my tail. This time, they didn't keep their distance. They were tailgating me, practically on top of me. The road was empty, and the isolation only made everything worse. I tried to focus on driving, my grip tightening on the wheel. The sedan followed my every move. I swerved into another lane, but they followed. I took another exit, just hoping to lose them, but they did the same. Panic surged within me. I was completely disoriented, and I had no idea where I was anymore. I just needed to get away. I turned onto a winding back road, hoping the sharp curves might give me the chance to lose them. But they stayed right with me, their headlights glaring behind me. The tension in the air was suffocating. I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put some space between us, but then, without warning, they slammed into the back of my car. The impact sent me jerking forward, and I barely managed to keep control of the wheel. My heart was in my throat as I realized they weren't just following me, they were trying to run me off the road. story. 5 after hours of driving through the vast emptiness of Texas, somewhere between Dallas and El Paso, I decided to pull off for the night. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me with no signs of civilization. My body ached from the long hours on the road and my mind was starting to cloud from exhaustion. The thought of continuing for another 2 or 3 hours until I reached the town seemed unbearable. The stretch of road I was on was barren and desolate. I hadn't passed another car for what felt like ages, and the darkness around me felt much more oppressive than the usual city night. Out here there were no streetlights, no houses, just pure, suffocating blackness. My headlights cut through it, offering the only illumination in sight around 10 p.m. I spotted a small gravel pull-off by the side of the road. It wasn't much, just an empty lot surrounded by a few scraggly bushes and some distant trees. But it was quiet and remote, which was all I needed at that point. I'd done this before on long road trips, sleeping in my car to save money on motels. I pulled into the lot, parking near the edge where the gravel started to give way to dirt and sparse vegetation. I locked the doors, cracked the windows slightly for some air, and reclined the seat. It wasn't a luxurious setup, but it was enough for a quick rest. The silence of the area was unsettling. There were no passing cars, no distant chatter or noise of people, just the sound of crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. In some ways it was peaceful, but in the stillness of the night it also felt eerie. I scrolled on my phone for a while, hoping to distract myself, but of course, there was no signal. I sighed and set the phone down, closing my eyes to sleep. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I began to drift off, I thought I heard something. The faint crunch of gravel or the soft snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was probably just animals. Maybe a deer, like I had seen earlier in the day, or one of the many rabbits darting across the road. It couldn't be anything else, right? But something about the sounds didn't sit well with me. They were too rhythmic, almost deliberate, crunch, pause, crunch, pause. The repetition of the sound, now unmistakable, made my heart race. It wasn't random, it was like footsteps. I sat up in my seat and stared out the window, trying to see anything in the dark. But my car's dome light didn't help. It only reflected my own face back at me. I turned it off, trying to calm myself, and kept my eyes focused on the darkness outside, but I couldn't see anything. After a long moment, I started to feel stupid for being so jumpy. Maybe I was overthinking it. I laid back down, trying to force myself to relax. I had to stop overthinking things. But then, just as I was about to drift off again, I heard a crunch, much closer this time. A deliberate step on the gravel, just a few feet from my car. My stomach dropped and my heart pounded in my chest, suddenly alert. Whoever or whatever was out there, they had to have heard my heart racing. I stayed completely still, straining my ears, hoping it was just my imagination. Another crunch, followed by silence. I couldn't bring myself to do anything. I was frozen in place, unsure whether to act or wait. I didn't want to turn the car on and make myself a target if someone was really out there. But I also didn't want to just stay here and risk whatever might be approaching. I reached for my phone, but there was still no signal. I was alone out here, completely cut off. I decided to wait it out. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe an animal was walking by. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The minutes dragged on, and every few seconds I heard another noise. Gravel shifting, leaves rustling, the faintest scrape of something against the side of the car. The sounds were so close now. I wanted to start the car and leave, but I couldn't move. I felt completely paralyzed. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, the car rocked ever so slightly. It was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. It felt like someone, or something, was pressing against the back corner of the car. I sat up abruptly, my eyes darting to the windows, but it was pitch black outside. The darkness had swallowed everything. I couldn't even make out the shape of the bushes just a few feet away. I felt trapped, as though the car was no longer my shelter, but a cage. And then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal scraping against metal right by my driver's side door. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, but then it grew louder, sharper. Someone was trying to pry open the door. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but deep down I knew exactly what was happening. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled for the car keys. I turned the ignition on and the headlights blazed to life, cutting through the darkness. For just a split second I saw him, a man crouched by my door, holding a crowbar. His face was pale, smeared with dirt, and his eyes locked onto mine. It was like a scene from a nightmare. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse and floored it, sending gravel spraying in all directions. The man stumbled but didn't fall. He stood there, motionless, watching me as I sped away. The crowbar hung loosely from his hand. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, finding a gas station with lights and people. I parked under a streetlight and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to calm myself down. I couldn't believe what had just happened. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I have no idea what might have happened. Now, every time I pass a roadside pull-off, my stomach turns. I'll never sleep in my car again, ever.